Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. Okay, once you understand that our bodies are interacting with our environments all the time, you start to look at things differently, right? Like light isn't just light. There can be healthy light, there can be super toxic light. Same with sounds. Sound can have a variety of different effects on our body depending what the sound is and where it comes from and how it's made. But what about all of the silent and invisible frequencies? For example, the ones coming out of the devices that we're surrounded by all day. These are referred to as electromagnetic frequencies. And what kind of effect are they having? So, to cover that topic, we have Nick Pineault with us today. He's a citizen journalist from Montreal, Canada. Yay, Canada. And the #1 best-selling author of The Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs. Nick's been a passionate advocate for safe technology since 2016. He's been on a billion different podcasts. He speaks at conferences. He hosts his own annual summit, which is excellent. He has one coming up. Link is in the show notes. And he has become really one of the best people in the world for non-technologists and non-scientists to refer to understand what the heck is going on in our bodies, given the fact that we live in this like very non-native EMF filled technological soup all day and all night. So in this episode, we take a really honest look at what all of this means for our bodies and what we can do about it. So I'm warning you, it can be a little intense to look at the research behind the biological effects of all of our devices, given that we're surrounded by them all day long. Our children are surrounded by them. They're in our workplaces. So we work really hard to stay focused on the things that we can control, because there is a lot of stuff that we can't control, i.e. where cell towers go up, where 5G antennas go up. But there are so many things and so many choices that we can make that actually make a really big difference. So I really appreciated having Nick come on and walk us through some of the ways that we can thrive despite our tech-saturated world. This is a fascinating, info-rich episode, but it also brings a lot of hope and a lot of ideas on what we can do differently. Enjoy. Nick Pineault, the EMF guy, welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Yes, we've got a couple of crackpot Canadians. You're in Montreal, right? I'm originally from Toronto. So today the Canadians are going to talk about EMF. And I want to just start by asking you sort of what your high level explanation of what EMF is, because on this podcast, we talk a lot about light. And so our audience is very familiar with the concept that the light frequencies coming out of our phones and our laptops are dysregulating our biology.
Sure.
In many ways from a circadian standpoint, but we haven't gone deep on the other frequencies that are coming out of these devices and what they are doing.
Sure. So
well,
I think that's a great way to start. You know, the blue light story and the fact that devices can disrupt your circadian rhythm, and also the fact that if you go and get enough sunshine in the morning, first thing in the morning when the sun goes up, and then when it also goes down, and of course throughout the day, you're also downloading information from nature that can resync that circadian rhythm. So it shows you two things. It shows you that the human-made EMFs in the form of visible light, in that case emitted by screens or light bulbs of the wrong frequencies, can negatively impact us, can kind of disrupt our normal ability to function optimally. And for some people, it's worse than others. So there's even individual sensitivity to that light. Maybe that light impacts the first person 5% in the reduction in their sleep quality, but maybe the next person it's 50%. So there's also a wide range of different reactions to that light, and it will depend on your health status, but also genetics and just sometimes it's kind of being unlucky and you're just very sensitive to these changes in the light environment. At the same time, it shows us that natural EMFs in the form of visible light emitted by the sun, and of course some of the sun spectrum is also invisible, part of the UV and part of infrared. It gives us the right information, and it is biocompatible with our body. It gives us information that helps us regulate our bioelectrical sensors throughout the body. And it's picked up by the eyes, it's picked up by the skin, where you have sensors for that light, and it helps us function better. So now replace that visible light with invisible signals. If you go down in the EMF spectrum in frequencies that are lower than light, you have radio frequency radiation, for example. That's the radiation that connects phones and cell towers, phones and Wi-Fi routers and my computer, or my Bluetooth earpiece that I don't wear, but let's say I had one, and my phone. So all of these signals are in the radio frequency range that ranges from around, let's say, 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 gigahertz is pretty much all the bulk of our exposure nowadays. And what we know is that that exposure is not something we had back in nature, right? And ancestral times, 100 years ago, we had exposures in that range of radio frequency that was a quintillion times lower compared to nowadays in Montreal. So a quintillion
Wow.
times is 1 and 18 zeros in how high this has increased. So some people argue, well, radio frequency radiation comes from space, and we have a background level of radio frequency radiation. That's correct, except they miss the part where the intensity is now a billion times a billion higher than just what our grandparents were exposed to. So that conversation, is completely irrelevant if you don't talk about the intensity of it all. And then the fact that the signals are not the same, right? When you have light, a light source, the sun emits light in all direction, for example, and is not necessarily pulsed in a particular way, and then has a balanced spectrum. All of these things that I mentioned are part of what makes the sun biocompatible. It has certain characteristics to it. It's not just, light. There's
Right.
intensities, there's pulsation, there's different things that if you turn it into a light bulb and you say, well, this light bulb just looks to me like it's giving light, there's nothing to it. But in reality, there's sometimes the spectrum is all wrong. So you have a big spike of blue, which is not balanced with red, and you don't have the full spectrum you would get from the sun. And then you have the wrong intensity in the sense that outside I would get in the hundreds of thousands of lux or something like that, and inside here I'm getting 500 or even below. I don't know by heart, but for sure it's way more intense outside. So inside you barely have any stimulation from these light sources, and you'd be hard pressed to find a light source that you can put on your ceiling that is as intense as the sun. It doesn't work. It cannot be found. So you also have sometimes flicker from artificial light. That is another characteristic that you don't necessarily perceive, because that flicker that you perceive, of course, it would annoy you. But even the screen in front of me is flickering at a rate that cannot be perceived, and yet we know that it can give you brain fog, or it can create headache or eye strain. And also the long-term effects are not very well understood, but even among light researchers, or even among I'd say light bulb engineers, I found information that they don't necessarily feel very comfortable with the idea of having excessive flicker, because of there are some studies showing harm and they don't want to be liable. So there's discussions in that industry. Now think about radio frequency radiation as just a sort of invisible light. And what
Right.
we know is that it is read by the body. And it is read by the body at the cell level and at the mitochondrial level. So our cells have many different types of channels in them that shuttle certain minerals in and out of the cell. And it looks like most of the effect is on these channels. The fact that they open or close is voltage regulated, and that's calcium, potassium, sodium, and maybe even other channels that I personally don't know about, but most of it is happening in these channels. And the fact that we have a lot of electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic, right? An electric component and a magnetic component, that's electricity, quite simply. You have voltage going around you in the form of Wi-Fi, and it's completely random. It's at frequencies that have never been seen before. And then the intensities varies in time, and the pulsation is all over the place. So these signals are completely foreign to the body. So what does the cell do with this signal? Well, it tries to deal with it, and it becomes dysregulated. So it negatively impacts our cell's ability to just function as normal. And what is the consequence of that? Well, it depends on where you're exposed, and then what frequencies, what intensities, and then for what length of time. But one of the example that is, let's say, the scariest and the most dramatic is the increase in cancer risks. But that's a long-term thing, right? If you talk with a phone, you have an increase in ipsilateral cancer risk. That means same side, right? You talk on the
Okay.
right ear, you get a brain tumor on the right side of the face or neck. It might be thyroid, it might be parotid gland, it might be glioblastoma, acoustic neuromas, and there's probably others that have been
Hmm.
linked with cell phone usage.
And that's linked because you're pressing, when you talk on the phone, you're pressing it into the side of your head where
And
all
it's
of
very
those.
close. The exposure is very close, and also for
Yeah.
extended periods of time. So the mechanisms might be that, the ion channels are not working as great, so maybe you cannot detoxify as well. Some have proposed that apoptosis, the programmed cell death that's supposed to happen when a cell it must be killed by your own body to get rid of it, or else it might turn into a cancer, or start forming a tumor. And I from what I know, this process is always ongoing, and your body is getting rid of cancerous cells on an ongoing basis. But maybe that process is hindered or is not as great. So over time, well, there's a tumor that starts developing, and your body cannot ward it off. So just because of the presence of the phone. But deeper though, and let's avoid cancer for now, because
Yeah.
if people are interested to be healthy, avoiding cancer is not the right way to do it. It's kind of
Yeah. We
just
want to
avoiding.
thrive fully in the
Well,
present
exactly. If
moment.
you want to feel
Yeah.
good, it's another thing. Let's talk about energy production, because I know that, in quantum biology, you talk a lot about the mitochondria, and
Yeah.
the fact that the mitochondria is always sensing the outside environment, right? These powerhouses of the cell are sensing what's happening outside. And if they sense danger, or if something disrupts their functioning, then you have a lowering of their ability to produce energy. And what happens with radio frequency radiation, I'll talk about the research of Dr. Paul Heroux from McGill, because he's a fellow Montrealer and French Canadian. And he's really one of the top researchers around the mitochondria effect of EMFs. And he says that whenever you change the voltage of the mitochondria by plus or minus 2%, that's a small change at the mitochondrial level, but that's sufficient to have a change in energy production, and, let's say, a lowering of energy production and an increase in oxidative stress that is produced. So the analogy that works for me, because I'm not very deep into biophysics, is that the engine of your cells is running dirtier. I don't know if
Okay.
that's correct, but that helps me understand. It produces more oxidative stress for the same unit of energy production. And this is how Dr. Paul Heroux puts it. But not only is this happening with a change of voltage that, could be just from Wi-Fi or cell towers or cell phones. So overall, our energy production goes down in these areas of high electro smog, if you will, right? We're living in it, and it prevents us from having the best energy production possible. But also, our cells take weeks to recover from such a change, from such an electrical change coming from an external force. So it's not as if we can adapt to it within, a few hours and we're fine. He says that it takes up to 3 to 4 weeks for cells and mitochondria to adapt to these new changes. The problem is that our electrical environment now is ever changing by the second. So we never fully adapt. And I think that's part of the problem of why it's so pernicious, and why we're seeing effects that are short, and then long term it becomes
Yeah.
almost like a weight that people carry on their shoulder. If you live in a city, or if you're always exposed by your devices, maybe it's fine for a certain period of time, but now it's been decades that we've been exposed to this wireless. In the case of Wi-Fi, almost 2 decades. Cell phones, especially the last 15 years, but nowadays, it's children that have cell phones. So they just come with this weight that they have on their shoulders, and their inability to have the best mitochondrial status possible.
Okay. So thank you. That is a very, very robust explanation. And so I just kind of want to summarize and make sure everyone's tracking here. So we started off talking about circadian rhythms and how the frequencies coming out of, say, a phone or a laptop or a television um, are dysregulating our circadian biology compared to what is happening outside. Um, and then, like you were saying, some people say, "Oh, but there's blue light in the sun that comes out of the sun. So why is blue light bad?" And it's like, well, it's A, only in the middle of the day, and B, balanced out by all of the other frequencies.
Yes.
It's a completely different, plus all of the ways that you explained that the sun works that these devices do not. So now we're adding another level on that, on top of that, and looking at the non-visible frequencies coming out of these devices, which are, I guess, to sum it up, stressing out our cells and causing our mitochondria to function at a lower level than they would be without this exposure.
100%.
Okay.
Exactly. And I would
Okay.
say that it's even, you can look at the consequences of, changing mitochondrial efficiency could change anything in your body. So that's why
Yeah.
then, if we talk about, if we get into the nitty gritty, we can talk about hormones, we can talk about, you know, we could talk about liver function to,
Yes.
muscle function. Everything could be impacted if you go this deep and talk about the mitochondria, of course. And there are certain lines of research that are stronger than others. One of them is, the reduction in fertility in men who keep phones in their pocket. Another one might be even the reduction of testosterone production in men has been very well demonstrated. Another one is, the formation of a fetus. So pregnant moms that are exposed to more phone radiation have a greater risk of producing children that have an ADD, ADHD type behavior and food allergies. So it shows maybe there's an effect on brain formation or immune system maturation, or maybe the formation of the nervous system itself. So there's many different mechanisms we can get into. But I think just talking in terms of noise from the environment is simpler to think about it. You don't have to necessarily get too geeky about it, but if you realize that the body is trying to read the natural frequencies, and at the same time has to face all of these random frequencies that we've introduced in the form of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and radio frequency, and also the wrong type of light. But if you go outside, I think that the light environment, at least I don't see like how artificial light during the day would overwhelm your ability to get sunshine. But the radio frequency radiation is always there, and it's a sort of noise. And what happens to your ability to sense the outside environment if you introduce a lot of noise? We have indications that it's preventing our body from being optimized at that level. For example, there's research on the vitamin D receptor by Professor Trevor Marshall. And the vitamin D receptor is quite simply, it's a receptor that will have light information, produce vitamin D. I don't know much about it. I just know that there's research showing it is disrupted in its ability to produce vitamin D when it encounters a signal that resembles Wi-Fi around the Wi-Fi frequency.
Mm.
So it is not very hard to think or to imagine that we have many types of bioelectrical sensors in our body that are trying to do stuff. Read the sun environment, convert vitamin D, put the vitamin D in circulation, feel good. Now you introduce noise. So maybe your ability to read the environment is starting to decrease. And if you are more sensitive, and maybe your bioelectrical systems don't have that resilience anymore, they're maybe easily disrupted by a little bit of signal. And that's why we have individual sensitivity to these frequencies. Individual sensitivity that can be felt, and even individual sensitivity that cannot be felt, in a sense, because the effects will vary from one person to another. And sometimes it has to do with, again, their bad luck, and maybe they have certain genes that just make them exquisitely sensitive to this radiation. But maybe also they have this load of different problems. And this is often what environmental medicine doctors I've spoken to during my summit tell me. People never have electrosensitivity alone, right? They have
Hmm.
electrosensitivity, low vitamin D, chronic infections, food allergies, this, that, and they become almost allergic to everything, including the electrosmog. So to get out of it, I think the message is that, you have to reduce your exposure to both the visible spectrum of these artificial EMF, but also the invisible. And it makes it challenging that you cannot see it, but there are tools that can help you do so. And then a large set of habits that you can develop that help you, act in a way that will expose you to less and less EMFs over time.
Great. Okay, and I want to, yeah, on the end we're going to finish by how to do that. And so one thing I want to pick up on that I think is so interesting, right? It's like when you go all the way upstream, so far upstream that you're looking at health through the lens of, subatomic processes and mitochondria, the symptoms that can show up, even if the causal mechanism is the same, the symptoms that can show up can vary across the board, from fatigue to cancer to brain fog to diabetes to and and yet if you go that far upstream, the causal level is still all of these visible and invisible frequencies that we are bombarding our bodies with,
100%.
just
Yes.
showing up differently for different people.
And it's not just, of course, it's not just the artificial light and the invisible EMFs as well. It's the chemicals also contribute to that confusion. Although, it's at the molecular level. The molecules that enter your
Hmm.
body and have to be processed also take up resources. They take up
Right.
vitamins and minerals, and
So
they
like
will,
glyphosate and plastics and
for
like
sure,
the
exactly.
toxins we're more familiar with,
and
the
and not only that,
physical
and that,
toxins.
that's
Right.
not something I talk about very often, but the synergies between radio frequency radiation and different types of pollution are known in many scientific studies. And that's a very, very concerning line of research, where we have many, many studies in which you expose animals to a certain agent. Let's say it's a certain level of lead that does not seem to create an effect. The rats are able to process that lead and still be, you don't see an increase in mortality or things like that, or tumors. And yet, when you have the same levels of lead and you add radio frequency radiation, now you see an effect. So in many
Hmm.
cases, we have a certain toxin, and it acts in a sort of toxic additive synergy with radio frequency radiation. And there's several reasons to think that might be because the radio frequency radiation is causing oxidative stress. Maybe it's lowering your antioxidant status over time. Or maybe it's just, again, comes back to the mitochondria. The rat's mitochondria act in a way that is subpar, that is not efficient. And now they're not able to process lead as well.
Right.
Their detoxification ability goes down, or maybe they don't sleep as well. Who knows? I mean, I'm not.
Yeah.
We don't have thorough questionnaires to ask these rats what they think about the experiment, but we have the mechanisms that show us that if you add radio frequency in an environment that is currently dispolluted with so many environmental toxins that we already know are carcinogens, or possible carcinogens, and things that are mitochondrial poisons, then you probably have, a synergistic effect. And that's, let's say, another reason to lower your radio frequency radiation exposure, because it might make every other exposure even worse.
Right. So it could be that because the body is like just such an unbelievable brilliant. I mean, it can handle so much when you think about everything we're throwing at it.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it could be handling a certain level of toxin load, but then you add in that those frequencies and it tips over and can no longer handle it for could be a variety of reasons, but it's just like it's too much. Like we've broken the system.
Exactly.
Okay. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is why this isn't common knowledge. So you have a summit coming up that on the topic of electrosensitivity.
Hmm.
And the speakers look so amazing. We're going to put a link in the show notes to the summit. I highly recommend everybody go check it out. But I was looking over the speakers and I flashed back to a time probably about 7 or 8 years ago when I first started hearing. I'm always out on the fringes of things. So I started hearing people talk about this and what I would do is I would hear like a podcast or I'd hear someone bring up a topic like this and I'd be like, really? Could that be true? So what would I do? I would go to Google, I would put in the terms that I was hearing, and I would try from a layperson, a non-scientist point of view, I would try to figure out like, are these people crazy or is there something to
Yeah.
this? So what is the scientific community saying? So I would put electrosensitivity into Google and everything I would get back, there would be like some, Google's very mainstream in its results, right? So there'd be like some kind of like, well, maybe, but probably not. And it
Yeah.
ranged from skepticism to outright hostility, quackery. This is quackery.
Yeah.
And I was just left feeling really confused because people like you were talking about it and it sounded logical and compelling and there seemed to be credible evidence. And yet I couldn't find I couldn't find anything on it. So first of all, thank you for doing what you do because you're
Sure.
bringing everyone together and letting us know like we're not crazy. And then the second anecdote was around that time, I had my laptop open and one tab was Twitter and one tab was the Bio Initiative report,
Hmm.
which was, like a summary of all of the research from, I think, 25 different countries and scientists and doctors saying EMF exposure has implications for human health and they're not good. So I had that open in one tab. I Twitter opened the other tab, and the New York Times posted a story on Twitter that was like, the headline was basically, if you're worried about your cell phone, you have been taken in by a Russian disinformation hoax. Don't be
Oh
stupid.
yeah.
Do
Oh
you
yeah, I
remember
remember that one.
that?
It was a great one. New York Times quality. Yeah. Oh my God.
So I don't usually respond to things like on Twitter, but I was just I had the link right there. So I went in the comments and I was like, well, actually, I'm just reading this report with scientists from all over the world who show that there are, and I was waiting. I still at that time thought that journalists would be interested in credible evidence on different perspectives. And so I waited for them to respond and they just deleted the whole thing. They
Wow.
deleted and they reposted they reposted it with a slightly less snarky and condescending take.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I tell that story because this is why it's not common knowledge, right? Like they didn't seem to be interested in pursuing this line of research.
Yeah, I think it's many different things. I'll just say a few, I guess, a few buzzwords that are very important to understand this conversation on a scientific standpoint. Regulatory capture is horrendous when it comes to EMFs and radio frequency. So it means that the FCC, Federal Communication Commission in the US, and Health Canada is not better in Canada either, is completely captured with industry interests. In fact, one of the directors of the FCC swore before he entered the FCC to destroy the FCC from the inside out. That's in a public discourse at the CTIA, which is the lobbying group for the industry. And he said, once I get in the FCC, I'm going to destroy it. And he did. And
So you
then
had a technology executive get appointed to head the body
yes,
that's
and
meant
that's
to
not
keep us
all.
safe from technology companies.
All of them,
Okay.
all the top directors are industry people, ex executives at Verizon and these top wireless companies, or who represent the CTIA, which is the front group, the lobbying group for the industry. So the conflicts of interest are, it's not even conflict of interest, it's complete capture by the agency. So how can the FCC therefore determine health? Well, they cannot. And when they let's ask the legal system what they think of the FCC. Well, in 2021, activists and scientists, and many of them are ex-scientists of the or still scientists for the bioinitiative group and other groups as well, have presented in a court a lawsuit against the FCC saying you have not properly reviewed the scientific evidence. Here's what we found, and you're not looking at the science, and basically you're just reaffirming that things are perfectly safe when it's completely inaccurate on a scientific standpoint. And they lost in court. And in fact, the judges were very shocked by how the FCC was reckless in the review. And they said, my God, you haven't done your homework at all. And that was 2021. They lost in court, and they've been mandated by the courts to go back to the drawing board. And to this day, 3 years later, nothing happened. So they've been stalling things as long as they possibly can, because of course they don't have any intention of looking at the science, and they don't even have any expertise to look at the science. So it's basically a group of engineers that want to make sure that business is good, and this is why they've captured the agencies, because if you capture the agency, you're able to roll out more cell towers quickly, and the business is extremely good and lucrative. And the more you have hurdles to your 5G and 6G rollout, the less money you make. And there might be, Chinese competitors and other companies that come in, and that's a very dangerous proposition for business. And so I think that one of the worst example of lobbying around the world, and that's also what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told me in the interview, is the FCC. That's a prime example of regulatory capture. So there's that. Then, if you look at the history of EMF science, the more health effects have been found in scientific studies around, let's say, phone masts or cell phones or Wi-Fi, the less the funding has been donated to scientists. And so there's systematic defunding of these programs, and also part of the industry pressure to not find effects. There's a lot of hostility towards scientists who study this line of research. Some of them have been accused of fraud, and it was found, 15 years later, after incredible harm to their reputation, that it was a complete fabrication. So that's an example from Europe. There's also many scientists that have literally there's proof. One of them is the wargaming memo against Henry Lai, who's one of the top researchers around EMFs and DNA damage, where literally the telecom said, we will destroy his reputation and we have to take care of this. So it's not to say that all companies are evil, but the corporate playbook is just something that is repeated because it's effective. It's very effective to make sure scientists do not have the proper funding, make sure to put as many sticks as you can in their wheels, and make sure that the science is advancing at a snail's pace. And then there's also a lot of pro-industry, no-effect scientists that are of the opinion that almost, they have this bias towards no effect. Nothing is dangerous. It's not serious. And they are the most well-funded scientists. So there's a huge bias that these guys will get the money because we know that they're going to get us the results. So the funding sources will greatly influence the outcome in that line of research, even more so than with big pharma. So when you look at the entire science, you have to ask yourself, okay, who is independent and what have they found? Well, independent scientists are putting it all, are risking it all, really, because it's a very unpopular topic to study, very underfunded, and then even you get attacked. So one of them, for example, is Dr. Leonard Hardell. Hardell was arguably the first scientist to sound the alarm after Vietnam, to say that Agent Orange that was sprayed all over Vietnam and probably other countries was a carcinogen. And he was deemed, almost a national hero on a scientific standpoint for that research. All of a sudden, 15 years ago, he started studying EMFs. Now he's,
Mm,
shunned by the mainstream. Same thing
right.
happened with many different scientists, but Hardell and his colleague Mona Nilsson, a journalist from Sweden, have now published in scientific publications 8 different case studies of people getting sick after the installation of 5G antennas near their workplace or home. So that's been published and it's very hard to deny. And also, Hardell has been arguing for years that this radiofrequency radiation should be reclassified as a class 1 carcinogen next to
Okay.
tobacco smoke and asbestos. And that's the view of many scientists that are independent. It doesn't mean they're right, but at least we have to look at
Hmm.
it. And since 2011, the decision has been made at the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that this radiofrequency radiation is a class 2B carcinogen. But that's not the end of the story. It's kind of the beginning of the scientific research in a sense, because now we can build on it and look at the data that was missing. Why wasn't it classified in a class that is like class 2A, which is probable, or class 1 that is a definite carcinogen? And the reason is that the animal studies were lacking. We didn't have any large animal studies that are more long term for several years of exposure, for example, to have the human equivalent of a lifetime to really show that it's a carcinogen. But these studies came out in 2018. And since then, the scientists have said, we have all the data that we need. In fact, Anthony Miller, who's a very esteemed epidemiologist, said, if we reconvene a working group at the IARC and do a working group right now, and that was in 2018, he said, it is a class 1 carcinogen. It's just a matter of, having the bureaucracy do its thing, and
Hmm.
it will be deemed as carcinogenic as asbestos and smoking. But nothing has been happening. In fact, the WHO branch responsible for that, IARC, it really looks like the industry is again trying everything it can to not have a working group that was supposed to, I think, be nominated by now, and we barely have any news about it. So there's a lot of politics, a lot of lobbying, and they're trying to stall the science. That's really what's been happening in many lines of research. But now the research is so strong that it becomes very difficult for skeptics to kind of hold their ground and really consider this a tinfoil hat or conspiracy theorist topic, because you have people like Dr. Andrew Huberman at the beginning of 2023 who said, well, I didn't think it was serious, but a reader asked me about Bluetooth, and then I realized that keeping a phone in the pocket is, the data around that is even more convincing than BPA as far as the phone's ability to be an endocrine disruptor. And when I
Wow.
heard that personally, I said, we're in deep trouble, because you have a guy from Stanford that is a kind of a link between the alternative and the mainstream, because he
Hmm.
dives into new topics, and he talks a lot about quantum biology, but makes it very simple for the public to understand, and talks about the latest research on circadian rhythm and all of this, and light exposure and the dangers of blue light also. But he reviews radio frequency and realizes that there's no denying that your testosterone will go down and your fertility will be harmed if you have a phone in your pocket. And yet, you have health agencies to this day repeating that everything is safe. Both cannot coexist. Either it's safe, either it's not, right? So our current exposures are inherently unsafe. And you have the top agency, the FCC in the States, that is supposed to regulate these things, that is currently supposed to review the science and stalling the case. So we're really there's no pilot on this plane of EMFs. There's no
Right.
one who is spearheading the research. In fact, a few weeks ago to this date, the U.S. has at the NIH and basically the NTP program, the National Toxicology Program, that is part of the NIH, one of the sub programs of the NIH, if I understand correctly, has been basically abandoned this direction of studying EMFs for no really good explanation that they gave
Mm.
journalists. So they said, oh, we lack the funds. And basically, they were promising to do follow-up studies after a major rat study in 2018. And we don't know exactly what happened. But so far, it looks like, again, systematic defunding worked once
Right.
again. So there's it's all about the industry playbook. So at the moment, there's many things that we cannot know for sure about EMFs. We cannot say, that it causes cancer in every body part, for example, and things like that. We don't have many studies around colon cancer or whether it causes testicular cancer if you put it in your pocket, for example. We don't have this knowledge, and this is what many skeptics point towards, like, oh, you don't know for sure it's causing harm. But the point of scientists, including scientists from the Bio Initiative report, is that, look, everything we had prior to the introduction of 4G and 5G was showing hints of harm. And instead of being smart about it and preventative and starting to lower exposure, moving the cell towers away, reducing the power of devices, and maybe telling engineers, look, now you have to engineer an iPhone with 1,000-fold reduction in power and yet the same connectivity. No one has been given this
Right.
task in the engineering world, because maybe they would figure out a way to do it, except
Yeah.
no one requires them to do so. So there has not been industry innovation. In fact, I would claim there's been no industry innovation towards safety, because the rules are so permissive, and it's not even something that they want to do on a voluntary basis, because it would be a proof or an admittance that things are
Right.
unsafe, right?
So
So
they don't
it's
even want to try to be safer because then they
no,
have to say
no.
those other phones weren't as safe as we said they
Well,
were.
exactly. And now
Okay.
think about this. Another, and I know this is long-winded, but I think it helps people understand why
Hmm.
this is the case. It's kind of a complicated story. And the only thing I'll say quickly is that since the early 2000s, the biggest companies that are the world's top reinsurers, such as Lloyd's of London and their Swiss Re also, and other companies, have basically abandoned the wireless companies and said, guys, we will not insure you against damages, because the
Wow.
reinsurers looked at the data and they said, no, we're out. Forget about it. They
So
said,
so basically the reinsurers are like, if people come after you legally for harm
yes,
done by your products, you have no legal standing and
you're
we're not
dead.
taking that risk.
So their analysis on a very cold capitalist standpoint is that these companies are bound to go bankrupt if this comes out, basically. And if I can just mention, last week I heard that Bayer might be dismantled at this point, or at least separated, with the pharmaceutical branch, and the other branch that has bought the rotten apple, the poison that is Monsanto, because they bought Monsanto years ago. And at this point, they're in debt. In fact, they have one of the highest corporative debt in the history of the European Union at this point. So many observers think that Bayer is going down because they bought Monsanto, and Monsanto came with all of these lawsuits because of glyphosate harms. Imagine if the same is true for cell phone companies. Easily they could go under, even though they were one of the most lucrative businesses
Right.
on the planet right now. So a huge reason why the science is kind of, being obscured, and the telecoms themselves are doing everything they can for this information not to come out. I don't think it's that much of a grand conspiracy, but the capitalist side of things is
Yeah.
kind of the worst example that we can have in humanity, kind of this savage capitalism where you say, no, this cannot come out, this cannot be true. It
Right.
is like that. No,
So
there's no way
they're
this can be
locked.
true.
Yeah, they're locked in a system where they
Yes,
cannot acknowledge it.
exactly.
And so they're doing everything they can to slow down or stop the science from coming out. But at the same time, they're not really doing anything to make it better, because that would be an admission that the science is correct. So their position
Yes.
is, and this was the position that my husband lived under for many years is that this type of technology has no biological impact. It's
Yes.
completely safe. And there was, and that was the line. And when I first went off pieced into this research and I brought it back to my husband and he's like, well, no, it's non-ionizing, so it can't be penetrating, la la la.
Yes. Yes.
And I didn't know what that meant. So I went and looked it up and we went back and forth. And finally he was like, oh shit,
Yeah,
this is real. Um, and so, yeah, so it's one of those things where as soon as you look into it, to any like even a little bit, it becomes very clear. But it is very similar, I think, to the smoking, right? Where the tobacco company's position that they held for as long as possible was that smoking is not bad for you.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
so when I look now and I watch old movies and people are like smoking in the baby's nursery, and you're like, oh my God, I feel like that's where we're at. And I
Yeah.
remember I had a friend visit and I was just starting to research this stuff. So I still had like router boosters in every room of my house because it was 3 stories. So the Wi-Fi didn't reach the top floor. So I had this booster plugged into the wall. And a friend of mine came with her baby and she set up the pack and play and she laid the baby down and it was right next to the Wi-Fi booster. And I was like, I didn't even really understand any of this, but it felt wrong. I was like, I think I'm gonna unplug that. She was like, why? Oh, really? Do you
Yeah,
think it's having an effect? I'm like, I think maybe we shouldn't put the baby's head next to that thing. um, but we just are, we just don't think about it. There's so many things in the world to think about. There's so many things I know.
for sure.
Um,
Yeah,
but we really do need to. And so, okay. So let's get into to the fun stuff, right? Because one thing I think you just touched on that's really interesting is that it is totally possible to have these devices, but have them give off less poison, basically,
for
right?
sure.
Like it's not like, oh, you can't have a cell phone. Like there is a way to make the phone. And we have a Wi-Fi router in our house that we got from some guy in Europe who did all this research, and he built a Wi-Fi router that has a much, much lower radiation output. It turns itself off when it's not being used. So, for example, right now I'm home alone. I'm hardwired, but when everyone's home and everyone's working, the Wi-Fi comes on at a lower rate than from a commercial Wi-Fi router.
Hmm.
And then when they close their laptops, the Wi-Fi switches off. So, like, there are ways to live where we mitigate these things without, moving into a cave.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good example. The GRS Echo router. I'm
That's
familiar with the
it.
technology.
Yeah.
Dr. What is his name? John Rutger Schrader, something like that from
Yeah. He's in
I
the
don't know if you
Netherlands. I forget his
Netherlands. Yeah,
name.
there we
Yeah.
go. Very very nice guy, PhD. A lot of engineers are getting into this and coming up with safer technologies, and that's great. I think in the future it will be possible to vote with your dollars and purchase safer phones and safer tablets, safer laptops. At the moment, many people ask me, what's the safest phone on the market? What's the safest laptop? None of them are safe in the way that people want it to be safe. Safe for them would be, no health impact or little health impact. What we know is that the current levels of exposure are leading to health impacts, but we don't even know what is the safe level of exposure. So all we can do is try to minimize exposure as much as you can. That would be just the message. And if it means for you, you start with one action step, that's good enough. But over time, you get better, right? What is the safe dose of glyphosate in food, right? It's kind of a tricky question. Well, it's probably none, right? But how would you make sure that your food has none when the contamination is widespread in the environment and many crops are even sprayed after harvest with glyphosate? So it will be an impossible task, but you can do your best to pick foods that you think are cleaner. That's kind of how you should act towards EMFs. The first thing you should mitigate is the bedroom. And it's really because there's there's even though EMF in that range of radio frequency radiation is invisible, it looks like there's a strong circadian component to it, where if it negatively impacts your sleep, then of course it will impact everything else in your life, because if sleep is impaired, everything else is impaired. So make sure that within an arm's length from your pillow, there should be no cell phone or no wireless device whatsoever. Some people have, 10 different devices in their bedroom. Might be two phones, a laptop downloading something in a corner, maybe a tablet and it's on Wi-Fi and they keep it open because it's charging. So look at all these different machines and they need to be turned off, or put it in the next room if you're not sure. Right. So if it's in the
Okay.
next room, the effect will be much lessened because of that separation. It's not exactly like light in a sense that it can go through walls, it can go through
Hmm.
most building materials except maybe certain types of metal and concrete. But if you create distance, it will greatly help. So
Right.
a cell phone
So,
at 10 feet is much safer than a cell phone at 0 degree separation.
right.
Yeah.
So I love the line, distance is your friend.
Yes,
So
for sure.
for sure, in the place where we sleep, ideal situation is to have all tech out of the bedroom. Second best is to have it like on airplane mode or turned
Yeah,
off.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Then the second place I would mitigate is any device that is touching your body. And that's just because of the cancer risks. I wouldn't feel good kind of omitting that fact that some people have literally been killed by their phone. And that's a rare occurrence. But still, these types of glioblastomas exist, and some people they're not dead from their phone, but they lost hearing, or they have other things that tumors can create inside the body, which is very, very dangerous. So do not use your phone on the head or keep it in your pocket. I do not think that these uses are anything that will be health supportive. So you want to be on airplane mode if you carry your phone, or use a special case. For example, Shield Your Body is a very good brand, but there are good cases out there that can help mitigate some of the dangers. I know that some people want to keep their phones open. Their boss needs to be able to call them, or sometimes it's their spouse or their kids, and I respect that. But just find ways to carry it more safely. And if you're in just one spot, I'm at a computer right now. My phone is not in my pocket. I see a lot of men, especially men, that keep it in the pocket for no good reason. It's just a bad habit. Put it in front of you, right? 1, 2 feet from your person. The effects will still be there a little bit, but they're greatly mitigated compared to, tucking it into my shirt pocket, which is a very bad idea for the heart. Or many women put it in their sports bra, or yoga pants, very, very close to their ovaries. Very bad idea as well, because the effects, some of these effects are known, some of these effects are unknowns, and in a sense the unknowns are even more concerning than what we know for sure, because that research might come out in 40 years for all I know. I mean, I hope it's going to be sooner, but at this point, I've been doing it for almost 10 years, and I know that things are very slow to progress.
Yeah.
So don't be waiting for the science. Just be careful with these exposures. And what I'll also mention as let's say a third action step here is your workstation. Many people work on a computer these days, and many people use the laptop on the lap. Not only is it, very poor for your posture, but also you're exposing, again, your entire groin area, your stomach, all of your organs with this Wi-Fi radiation within 1 to 2 feet. So it's a very intense type of exposure. And if you can mitigate it, even from time to time when you work at home, which many people do, including these days, I don't know why I stopped going to coffee shops. I almost exclusively work from this office. I don't need to be on Wi-Fi on this computer. In fact, the Wi-Fi when I rented this place out with my wife was very poor, and I was very frustrated. I did Zoom calls like this. It was all choppy, and the voice kept breaking up, and I felt very embarrassed about it. But now that I'm wired with an Ethernet cable that goes from the router in my living room to this computer, now it's very fast, very stable, and zero EMF. Of course, I turn off
Right.
the Wi-Fi on my computer. That's something you need to do. But there's a good argument just on a quality of work and quality of life standpoint to be wired in. And not
That's
many
so
people.
true because we think
Yeah.
like, oh, we're gonna get off the Wi-Fi, like we're going back in time, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I mean, a wire is a much more efficient way
Yeah, it's
to
better,
be connected to
yeah.
the internet.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
And for those times that you need to move around, just consider Wi-Fi, as something
yeah,
that you should open if you need it and not the
yeah.
opposite, right? That a lot of people are
And
like, well, the
definitely turn
Wi-Fi,
off when you go to bed.
yeah,
Like
exactly, for
that's
sure.
an easy one. Yeah.
Before you go to bed, and for people that are not ready to not have Wi-Fi at all, or they can just the Wi-Fi is turned off on my router, but I can turn it back on whenever I need it. Usually I don't, but in rare occasions I will, and it's not that much of a big deal if you open it for a few hours because you have people over and I don't know, they want Wi-Fi, and I guess you just decide to comply with their level
Yeah.
of comfort that they want. But that's not such a big deal, because if your regular behavior is to turn it off, then you're doing a lot of good, and you're minimizing 99% of exposure is removed if you only will open Wi-Fi whenever you need it or whenever you want it. And even if you decide to
Right.
have Wi-Fi during the day, as you mentioned, put it on a Christmas light timer, or just turn it off, unplug the thing before bed, and then you just because you don't need that signal during the night. And there's a strong reason to think that this signal will interfere with your sleep quality and your ability to produce melatonin. And ironically, some researchers think that the pineal gland is perceiving radio frequency radiation as light. So which is a bit bizarre
Wow.
to think about, as
That
if,
makes total sense though.
yeah, it does.
I
And
mean, the pineal gland doesn't know what's visible and invisible. It's just getting the
well, exactly.
information.
Your eyes know that, but even who knows, maybe we're gonna find that the skin can even sense the environment beyond the visible spectrum. And maybe it is the
Mhm.
case. I mean, I haven't looked at all the research, but it's kind of hard for people to imagine that, their eye is a camera that just sees a very narrow band, but certain animals can see other bands. They can see an infrared, they can see, I think they can see some UV as well in the case of certain insects or lizards. And it's very fascinating. But think about the fact that many certain of your body parts can also perceive that radio frequency radiation as light. And wouldn't it be annoying if all of these EMFs were light? I mean, years ago, everyone would have been would have become completely crazy because of these exposures. But one of the reasons that I think keeps us in the dark about it, no pun intended, is just that it's invisible,
Yeah.
and it's hard to imagine. But you can use an EMF reader also, but
Mhm.
it's not necessarily. These days, I don't advocate this much to get started with an EMF reader, because sometimes it causes a lot of confusion. If you just follow the steps I talked about, you will be in the right direction. And then if you want to get more fancy about it, you can get a detector. You can hire a building biologist, for example. We have many of those on the summit, but that kind of talk about what they do and what they can do inside your home. But the idea is just to get started on this direction of reducing exposures, and then over time try to get better.
Right. Yeah, I think like it's the idea of just making it something that we think about, right? As
Yes,
opposed to something we don't think about.
for
Like
sure.
like I know like I still eat dessert after dinner, but I don't have sugar in everything because I know that I need to limit that for my health, right? And it's the same thing. It's like if we just start to think of this as, oh, this is something that needs to be mitigated and limited wherever possible, we're headed in a completely different direction where if it's just like as much as we can all the time, it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, and it's fun. Like we hardwired the television because everything's wireless now. Like why would you need your TV to be wireless? It just
Yeah.
stays in one place, right?
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
we wired it, but my son mostly uses it to play video games and he's like, "Oh man, why you guys are so weird." But as we were just talking about, is once it was wired, it was way faster. And he was like, "Oh, this is actually great."
Yeah.
So it's not, yeah, we're not like throwing out tech here. So, okay. So step number one is to mitigate and minimize wherever we can. And then step number two, I would say, would be like to build our personal resiliency,
For
which
sure.
is every other podcast episode on here. Right.
Yeah,
Like to do what we can to keep our biological systems as thriving as possible.
for sure.
Okay, so Nick, any last thoughts that you'd like to share? I do want to bring up the summit again. It's April 11th. The summit goes live. There's a free version, and then there's a paid version if you want to have the recordings, have access to the recordings long term. If you just want to jump in for free, it runs April 11 to 14. Is that right?
14, yeah, 4
Okay.
days, 20 speakers. We have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we have environmental medicine doctors, EMF mitigation specialists, and there's really a strong focus on electrosensitivity because, which we didn't talk about that much, but regardless of how much you are exposed, some people are exposed to low levels and feel very bad. Some people are exposed to very high levels of EMFs and feel good. They don't feel anything. But once they eliminate the exposure, sometimes they start feeling better. So there's also a
Mm-hmm.
masking effect in today's society where if you are always exposed to this radiation, it's very hard to figure out if you might be electrosensitive or if certain parts of
Yeah.
your health that you're still not happy about, joint pain or, your mental health or just your overall
Fatigue.
vitality, fatigue. Sometimes it's just fatigue. And you say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm trying everything, but maybe you're missing the EMF part. And
Yeah.
once you get it right, you'll start feeling better. So in many situations, this is the case. And I'll just say, as in closing, if you go camping and you feel way better, something is wrong with your environment back home, right? And
Right.
part of it is the light, part of it is the work stress and, chemicals in your home and mold. But let's not forget EMF and that discussion. In very large cities, the levels of electrosmog are very high. And when you get away from them, some people see their brain fog clear away and they start feeling
Mm.
better. And that's just a reminder that back in the city or back in your home, there are things that can be improved. And that, yes, you need to make yourself stronger. So that's a good point. And I'd say that the more you're exposed to natural frequencies, generally, the more you'll be able to handle these unnatural ones. I think it's really a focus on walking barefoot on the earth, getting enough sun exposure, sun first thing in the morning, in the evening before the sun goes down, proper vitamin D, let's say inducing sun exposure around noontime also. All of these things are very important. And it looks like even people that are electrosensitive would benefit greatly from doing these practices or at least building their tolerance to the sun and to even earthing is a big relief for many of them. So it really looks like the answers to the problems we've created are just there in nature.
Right.
Quite simply put, yeah, it's there for us to enjoy and to go back to more harmony in our body. So part of it is avoiding the bad, but also soaking it the good stuff. And sometimes it's as simple as taking breaks during the day to go outside, even if it's cloudy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And our bodies were built to thrive in harmony with our environment. And we've just put a lot of barriers in between that. So as many of those barriers as we can remove will ideally restore us to that coherence.
For sure.
All right. Nick, thank you so, so much. Your deep research in this area and your ability to explain it so clearly is a great gift to the world. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care, and thanks.